It's nice to see you all this evening. We had I feel this evening is somehow paired with the event that we convened here on Thursday evening when Gordon Brown was interviewed by Bruce Jones. One of the things he mentioned, of course, was that in this globalizing world, there are certain issues that need to be dealt with on a global scale. One of them, of course, is health and medical practice. And that is going to be what today's conversation concentrates on, though mostly in the US, of course, and around President Obama's administration. I'd like to just say briefly, so you have a sense ahead of time that this is one in a two-part conversation, since we plan in April to convene another conversation about healthcare, which will pull out some of the issues and discuss some of the more of the relevance to the UAE. We have invited indeed Dr. Toby Cosgrove, who's the CEO of the Cleveland Clinic, to discuss these issues with Andrew Rubin, who's one of the vice presidents in the medical school at New York. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our distinguished speakers today. We have a fabulous panel here, old-timers, if I can say, a lawyer, a political analyst, and a researcher of public policy and health issues, Rogan Kersh, Bob Shrum, and Diane Yu. They've instructed me to be brief, which probably means I won't manage that, but I'm going to introduce Rogan first, who's an associate dean and associate professor of public service at the Wagner School at NYU, where he moved in 2006 from Syracuse's Maxwell School of Government. He spent spring 2006 as Distinguished Fellow at Yale's Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity. Rogan has been RWJ Fellow in Health Policy and a Mellon Fellow in the Humanities. His publications include 2 books entitled Dreams of a More Perfect Union and Medical Malpractice and the U.S. Healthcare System. And he's published more than 50 articles and book chapters in addition to that on various aspects of public policy and healthcare. He is also a frequent media commentator on US politics and health policy. Rogan is currently completing a book on the politics of obesity and another on interest group lobbying around healthcare. I have a feeling one of those books might already be in press, actually, but not quite. Okay, so got it right. Bob Shrum, on the far right, my right, was senior. Seldom am I on the far right. Yeah, right. So he was senior advisor to the Kerry Edwards campaign in 2004, and I'm sure he's probably fed up with this description of him. But he was described in the Atlantic Monthly once as the most sought-after consultant in the Democratic Party. He served as senior advisor to the Gore 2000 presidential campaign, and he's also served the British Labour Party in its 2001 parliamentary campaign. He was a speechwriter for the campaign of Senator George McGovern in 1972, and was also a speechwriter for Ted Kennedy in 1980 in his presidential campaign, and subsequently became Ted Kennedy's press officer for 4 years. He writes widely, prodigiously. His works appeared in the New York Magazine, Los Angeles Times, the New York Times. He's also a columnist and has been a columnist for Slate and the Huffington Post. He's been consultant, and this is what he's perhaps most known for, in election campaigns, 30 winning Senate campaigns, 8 winning campaigns for governor, United States governorships, and also the mayors of New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia. One couldn't really expect anyone to have greater insight into the the US political system firsthand than Bob Shrum. He has published a book entitled No Excuses, Confessions of a Serial Campaigner, which I intend one day to read. Lastly, moderating this discussion will be Diane Yu, who is the Chief of Staff and Deputy to the President of NYU. Diane Yu was previously Associate General Counsel and Managing Counsel at Monsanto Company, the agricultural firm, which is one of the Fortune 500 based in Missouri. Prior to that position, she was general counsel for the State Bar of California. She was also a California Superior Court Commissioner. She was appointed by the President of the United States as a White House Fellow, and she's worked in private practice in Oakland, California. A national bar leader and frequent public speaker, she was the first woman of color to chair the American Bar Association's section of legal education and admissions to the bar, and the first Asian American to chair any ABA section or division of the ABA in its history. She is the immediate past chair of the ABA Commission on Women in the Profession, and she has many more accolades and sits on many boards. She received her BA from Oberlin, on whose board she also sits, her JD from the University of California, Berkeley, and a doctorate honoris causa from CUNY, from the City University of New York. It's a great pleasure to give you all the stage to yourselves.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that very generous set of introductions. We're going to kick this off. We're not going to waste any time. We're going to go ahead right away and start with Rogan Kersh, who's going to give us the best possible overview to the Obamacare legislation and what's in it, what's not, what should we do about it. Rogan.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks to Philip. It's remarkable what you've done with this institute in a relatively short time. I remember Bob and I were here, 2.5 years ago now, just after Obama was elected, and talking about what the future might hold, and here we are talking about what the future has brought. It's also always humbling to share a stage with Bob Shrum, so glad to be back in business with Bob. I'm going to start with specific attention to this historic new U.S. health policy or health reform law, the Affordable Care Act. I will talk about policy implications a bit more broadly, since I think there's global relevance of this. We'll then expand further with Bob talking about U.S. political landscape in general and focusing on the, as it says here, the future of the Obama presidency. So if there's time, we may even venture beyond all this to the 2012 election. Any Americans in the audience know how much Americans love to talk about upcoming elections long before they happen. I'll start with a quick overview, though, of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which I will mercifully summarize here as the ACA, the Affordable Care Act of 2010. It's the most sweeping single piece of U.S. social policy in the last 40-plus years, really since Medicare, passed in 1965. It represents an enormous overhaul of the U.S. health insurance system, really, as more than the health care system. This is mostly a reform of American insurance policies and practices. Some of the things it does, for example, is potentially one day will extend insurance coverage to 32 million Americans who currently don't have it. That's more than 1/10 of the U.S. population. So extraordinary reach from this piece of legislation. It also places a wide range of restrictions on what insurers may and may not do in the U.S. They can't deny coverage to anyone. They can't drop sick people or people who get sick from their coverage. They can't cap annual or lifetime insurance benefits. All of these things insurance companies in the U.S. have routinely done for decades. There'll also be rate reviews across the individual states so that if an insurance company in California or some other state jacks insurance rates up, they will have to first get permission from that state. So it's an extraordinary range of restrictions and limitations on what insurance companies can do. There's also a mandate. This is one of the most controversial pieces of this law. It mandates that all Americans, except for some, with a few exceptions, such as illegal immigrants who are left out of this entirely for political reasons, actually have to buy or otherwise receive insurance coverage. It also has a set of benefits, a whole range of things that are goodies in this policy. For example, most to do with insurance, but for example, covering dependents up to age 26 or providing donut hole so-called coverage. This is an insider term, but a certain group of elderly Americans who fall into a so-called hole where they don't receive full coverage for their prescription drugs will now receive it. So in a whole lot of ways, this also includes a great many benefits. There are things in this bill that are designed to reduce the cost of health care, which has been spiraling for years in the United States. And finally, there are also a set of fee or tax increases, also enormously controversial. Those three letters, TAX, are the three most controversial letters in American politics most of the time. This is the signature legislative achievement, at least so far, of the Obama administration, for better or worse. It's known informally, originally to critics, but now more or less everyone, as Obamacare. If you look carefully, you can see in this Band-Aid made in the Socialist Republic of the United States, you can see the original critics of so-called Obamacare, but people more or less use this term generally now. Congress began work on this massive piece of legislation and completed it for a social reform of this immensity relatively swiftly, at least completed part of the work. There were a lot of bumps and bruises along the way. There were these so-called town halls. In the summer of 2009, when it seemed as if this was going to possibly pass relatively quickly, Congress packed up and went home for a while. The House had already passed through many of the committees involved in health care, but members went home like Arlen Specter, a Republican turned Democratic senator, to very angry sets of constituents. That was the first warning there was going to be some real angry debate around this issue. Later, after it seemed it had passed both houses of Congress, by the end of 2009, it seemed poised to become law, a largely unexpected, except for politics watchers like Bob Shrum, victory by a Republican senator in the state of Massachusetts, Scott Brown, seemed to set the legislation back possibly permanently, in that Scott Brown became a Republican who brought the total of Republicans in the Senate to 41. If you know anything about American politics, you'll know you basically need 60 votes to get anything done. The Democrats' lead was reduced to 59, again imperiling health care. Forward it went, though. There was a health care summit in March of 2010, which was fairly widely seen as enhancing Obama's abilities. And you can see John Boehner, we didn't know then, but future Speaker of the U.S. House, looking across angrily as then Speaker Nancy Pelosi smiles. Finally, it passes in that March 23rd. You'll note from this TV capture of the final vote, not a single Republican in the House, just as not a single Republican in the Senate, voted yes on final passage. It is very, very rare in American history that none of the minority party members vote in favor of a piece of legislation as sweeping as this. To give you a point of comparison, when Medicare passed, there had been certainly deep and divisive debates about it back in the 1960s, but when the final vote came on Medicare, 20 Republican senators and 70-plus members of the Republican House voted in favor. So this is an extremely unusual moment. It set the stage for the kind of partisanship that, in fact, has continued since. At that moment, those supporters and opponents alike might be expected to take a breath and figure, the battle's over, now we can go forward to implement this law. That has not been, in fact, what has occurred. The road to implementation turned very quickly from celebration, this is a shot at the White House, President Obama, Vice President Biden, the moment it passed, moved very swiftly to anger. There were breakages or attacks on individual members of Congress's offices the days after. 2 days after the bill passed, this infamous, and now even more infamous after the horrifying events of January 2011, this is the infamous, again, Sarah Palin post, in which, if you'll notice up in the right or in the left-hand corner, these are 20 districts she identified where House Democrats in districts that were carried in the presidential election by McCain had nonetheless voted for the health care bill. These people had to be removed from Congress. She put, or someone on her staff put, gun sights over those districts. At the time, it caused some controversy. As some of you will no doubt know or recall, Gabrielle Giffords, the fourth name on this list, was in fact, after she was one of the two of those 20, only two of those 20 actually won re-election in 2010 in this midterm race. Gabrielle Giffords was shot, not fatally, although many others were killed, during a discussion, a town hall meet and greet. No one has obviously linked this unfortunate note to that directly, but it gives you a sense of the enhanced partisan danger surrounding this entire issue. The battle to frame issues in U.S. politics, like anywhere else, generally is carried out in the run-up and the debate around a bill. The framing battle has continued, if anything, more vehemently since the Affordable Care Act passed. We continue to fight this battle in American politics in a way that some say you don't see at all. I'll try to frame it, describe that for you. The opposition that's remained has been both on the legal front. I'll come around to the kinds of Supreme Court, or eventual Supreme Court challenges to this bill, as well as the political front. On the politics, I'll just note for a moment that one often is asked, or those of us who watch this are often asked, why are Republicans so dead set against this act, one that has actually been palatable to a variety of Republicans over the years, including Bob Dole, for example, a longtime Republican leader who ran for president against Bill Clinton in 1996, who introduced or at least supported a health reform not that dissimilar to the one that passed here. Why did not a single sitting Republican in Congress vote for this final passage, again, of a bill that had been palatable in earlier versions to Republicans in the past? There's various reasons. Some say it's ideological. The Republican Party has moved farther to the right. But I think the real reason is this. You don't have to be a crack Republican strategist to figure out that previous massive entitlement programs like this one, ones that will give benefits to not just uninsured people, but lots of Americans in various ways, the kinds of benefits I described or at least gestured to briefly earlier. A bill that gives this kind of benefits to a wide swath of Americans will inevitably reward the party that was responsible for its passage. We saw this after Social Security, though it took a while. Once Americans came to embrace Social Security in the 1930s, it helped to cement the Roosevelt coalition that lasted for a generation or more. After Medicare passed in the 1960s, it took a while, it took about a year for Medicare to begin to achieve the kind of popularity that's made it a sacred object among American voters today. But again, Democrats were rewarded for years after the passage of Medicare. Again, you don't have to be a brilliant Republican strategist to figure out that if you're in the wrong party, it's very likely that once this act takes hold, Americans come to embrace and appreciate its benefits, your party, the Republicans in this case, are in bad shape electorally. Obviously, lots of things go into making up electoral outcomes, but this is something to watch. So I think this is partly why the opposition has been as vehement and fierce as it has been. This is creating a social entitlement that will reward Democrats in voters' eyes for years to come. One of the many cases that was brought against it, this is a Attorney General of Virginia who's gotten some real coverage for his crusade against health reform as well as a variety of other things. All right, implementation, once the bill passed, is a road that began relatively swiftly. Most of us who have any familiarity with American politics generally understand or have some sense of American legislative debates up to the moment a bill passes. Any of you who grew up in the U.S. Around the age I am will remember the Schoolhouse Rock figure in the marvelous, Julie's nodding, a couple of others of you have seen this, the I'm Just a Bill. This was an iconic American Saturday morning cartoon presentation explaining the legislative process. And what I certainly didn't notice then, although I learned a lot of legislative politics that way, is that the end of this, the law has been passed, the president has signed it, the little bill is celebrating. His, her, whatever this bill gender is, life is done. It's not the way it works in practice. The implementation fight, the politics of implementation around the Affordable Care Act has been, if anything, more intense than the politics around the legislative debate that delivered us this policy. I want to spend a few minutes on that implementation debate, give you a sense of whether, in what ways the act itself might be taken down, gotten rid of, and then turn it over to Bob to talk about the wider context of American politics in which this debate is situated, and which, let me note, it has helped to fuel. 3 keys to implementation. The first is, and this is true of almost any major American piece of legislation, the first is complexity. This is what the rule-making process, the beginning of implementation in American politics, what it looks like. The steps, you can't see these, the point is all the variety of steps simply to get a bill from its passage as a law to the point where the delivery of services begins. It goes through all these stages. Just to break out one of these for you, this is the final rule stage. This thing, the rule, i.e. the actual nitty-gritty of implementation, the way the bill will be delivered as a service once it's become a law, all these parts after the thing has been written, reviewed by the public, rewritten, there are still all these steps before it actually goes into delivery of services. It is an extraordinary, complex, laborious. Our colleague at Wagner, Paul Light, complains about how difficult it is. He's complained in writing about how difficult it is to get a bill from the moment it's passed to when services are finally being delivered. It takes years in many cases. So key one, not unusual in American politics, the complexity of actually transforming this piece of legislation, this law, that is, this statutory piece of work, into delivery of services. Complexity, yes, but paradoxically perhaps, in this situation, it's also been a remarkably swift implementation process. This has not been widely noticed. I've been doing some work myself on how fast various provisions of the Affordable Care Act, as they break it down into its hundreds of different pieces, the age 26 dependence part, the individual mandate, and so on, through literally hundreds of individual pieces. These normally each take months, even years to be written. There's a period of public comment. It's then rewritten. It goes through that elaborate final rule stage, much of it involving White House actors that you saw. The Affordable Care Act, its first 150 rules or individual pieces, have been implemented at an unusually swift rate. They have in cases, the administration, this is done usually through the agencies, so the Department of Health and Human Services, to some extent the Food and Drug Administration, have been handling implementation. For the first time in my knowledge of American politics, the administration set up an implementation war room. You've heard of campaign war rooms. Bob's been involved and even runs some of those, where you get an extraordinary amount of super bright people to work with immense focus on, in this case, electing some new leader. We have, again, there may be other examples, Bob will correct me if I'm wrong, but I cannot think of another example in American policy history where there has been an implementation war room, where HHS set up, deep in the bowels of the building, an entire room, hired, in some cases, lots of new people, 50 or 60 new people to come in and write the various parts and move through as swiftly as possible to this rule. It's a little told or a little known part of the story, but I find it fascinating. And what the administration, I think, is doing is building a bulwark against the possibility of repeal. If you've got, especially popular, parts of the act in place, people have begun to receive the benefits, it's all that much more difficult to take it away. And the pace of implementation has been, I will perhaps exaggerate slightly, but it's felt to me, a long-time policy watcher, breathtaking. These are some of the major pieces of this bill. No reason you have to go through and memorize them, but some of the major parts of this bill that were implemented in every single case before the expected date. Usually government does things, usually the federal government does things a little after expected dates. They take longer than expected, et cetera. All these were done more rapidly. In one case, the elimination of co-pays for preventive care, this rule went into effect a year, an entire year before the bill expected it to be or called for it to be. So what you're seeing, relatively quietly, this has not been written about widely, certainly Democrats were not beating their chests about it, lots of ways in which they took fast tracks, shortcuts, got waivers, for example, of the laborious and slow federal hiring process, something else our colleague Paul Light has complained about. They circumvented the kinds of very slow federal hiring rules that usually are in place to get these folks in the war room and get the benefits beginning to flow. And so they did. Brilliant implementation strategy that didn't get much publicity, but I think it may help protect this bill when the end comes. Note the policies there, they all polled very highly favorable or popular. They put in place the parts of the bill, in some cases they front-loaded them in the bill itself, in the act itself, sorry, but they put in place aspects of the act that were most popular. These are all things, as you can see, that were favorable or very favorable. They're all the ones that were put in place early on among this first 150 wave of pieces being implemented. So, complexity, yes, always a part of American implementation politics. Short-run speed, I haven't seen anything like this before in a major piece of legislation in American history. You've got this interesting, again, paradoxical balance. Overlay that, however, with the third key to understanding the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, the long time horizon for a whole variety of reasons, including funding in some cases, ability to fund this bill over time. They've had to implement it by design over a longer period. This is again, something you won't need to memorize, but you can notice that this bill will not be fully implemented, will not be fully paid for in this case, until beginning in 2018. These dates are when these various provisions are supposed to go into effect by. They can speed some of this up, but various pieces they can't. For example, the infamous individual mandate will not be in place until 2014. The health care exchanges that are set up state by state to provide low-income people or otherwise vulnerable populations with insurance coverage will not be set up until 2014. So lots of pieces of this are in a longer time horizon. That means as these things come up, in some cases the taxes and fees used to pay for the Affordable Care Act, in some cases the actual particular statutory provisions, as they come up, we will have a fresh political fight all over again. We will be fighting about this bill and aspects of it until 2018. That is not a recipe for letting the waters calm and the benefits begin to settle into the populace's mind. I think the hope on the administration's part was, and the HHS implementers specifically, get this in place quickly, enough benefits so that they can take hold, and we'll move forward as we must. To the interest groups involved, I've given you some of the main players here. You won't know what all these initials stand for, but I want one of the interest group people here, the one who's on the left in the middle there, works for America's Health Insurance Plan, the chief lobbyist for the insurers, very skilled lobbyist named Karen Ignani. She said at one point when a reporter asked her, so this whole thing's over, this was probably July of 2010, the bill had been passed and some of the implementation was already beginning, and she said it's never over. She was right about that. I thought I'd put this up just to give you a sense of some of the players. Notice an interesting shift in American politics. Major piece of legislation attracted an enormous amount of interest. The interest group community, the lobbying community, has traditionally in U.S. politics been male. Of the chief lobbyists that work on this, a majority, in fact, 6 of the 8 you see up here are women. Interesting shift in American political life, as befits our Bar Association head of Committee on Women. All right, that's the implementation story. I want to close with 4 or 5 minutes on the kinds of attacks or challenges that are being made and will continue to be made to this bill, to this act. Sorry, I keep calling it a bill. I got into that habit when I was working on it before. In Congress, the enormous success of Republicans in the midterm election, 87 new Republican members, the vast majority of those from formerly Democratic districts. This is the leadership of the Republican Party. They listed during the campaign, make no mistake about it, their midterm elections were predicated in part on a repeal and replace mantra, which in district after district, state after state, Republican candidates ran against the Affordable Care Act. They spent, one estimate I've seen is that candidates themselves spent more than $7 million on advertisements specifically and solely opposing this piece of legislation. Forget all the advertisements about how Obama was a socialist and so on. Just Anti-Affordable Care Act. By contrast, between March and mid-September of an extraordinarily important midterm election, not one Democratic candidate, not a single one, either an incumbent or one running, ran a single ad defending or otherwise mentioning the Affordable Care Act. This was not getting a lot of support from their own party. Now, obviously, it wasn't polling very popularly, but it's a remarkable fact that this extraordinary piece of legislation passes and no one until after September runs on it in any way. So, Republican House pushed their repeal and replace mantra, which they felt was responsible for, and there's some academic evidence, I'll spare you, but there's some academic evidence that the opposition on Republicans' part to the Affordable Care Act, to the ACA, helped boost their vote totals in some districts. They went to work immediately in 2011. The Republicans took over the House for the first time in 4 years. And the first substantive vote they took was to repeal the Affordable Care Act. To give you a sense of the timing, John Boehner was gavelled in on a mostly ceremonial day on January 5th. On January 7th, they held the first significant vote on repealing the Affordable Care Act. And sure enough, about a week later, they had to wait a little time after the Gabrielle Giffords shooting. But after that, they passed the repeal in the House. It then failed subsequently in the Senate. So that immediate legislative assault on the bill itself, repealing something that had passed only weeks before, only months before, was held back. Nonetheless, there's other ways that Congress, the first of our sources of challenge to this bill, are coming at it. The U.S. government, as some of you who follow American politics must have a sense, is in danger of running out of money. They're passing very short-term continuing resolutions week by week or 2 week by 2 week to keep the government afloat. But they need some kind of spending bill, and they've cobbled together a kind of a compromise. The House has passed its version, the Senate has passed its version, to keep the U.S. government afloat, to keep it running fiscally for the next few months. In that bill, that essential spending bill, it's passed the Senate and the House in different versions, so they have to now reconcile and come up with one version. There are 9 amendments in the House version that defunds the Affordable Care Act. Yes, it still exists. The legislation's on the book, but they take the money away from various aspects or parts of it. And on Capitol Hill, they call this zombie legislation. It lives on, but it's hollowed out and dead inside. One of these defunding amendments, just to the point of this rush implementation pace, would completely defund HHS's implementation effort. Shut down the war room, get rid of all the work they're doing to try to put this in place. That's the most prominent of these amendments. 9 of these amendments, let me just note again, defunding the Affordable Care Act passed the House in this essential spending bill. They stuck them into this bill. The Senate did not accept any. There'll be some real controversial back and forth between these two, on the conference committee to determine whether the bill does survive and at least the funds for it are there. There will be there are 115 separate appropriations pieces, taxes, fees, et cetera, that are provided for in the Act that remain to be implemented. I would not be surprised if the majority, if not all of those 115 over the next 6 or 7 years are battled out, debated, tried to be taken down by the Republican House, and who knows, eventually Republicans in the Senate if they get closer to a majority. So there's this congressional effort to, if not actually repeal the bill itself, to take away the funds so it becomes some kind of zombie legislation, or to attack the sources of funding for it. The bill itself cost around $940 billion. That's the estimate the Congressional Budget Office gave in March of 2010 that partly allowed it to pass, estimating that was the cost, but the benefit, the money raised by it through taxes, through fees, through required payments by the industry that benefits, insurance industry, pharmaceutical industry, and folks who actually will, with all these new patients, will be receiving new funds. This piece, again, requires additional fees, taxes, et cetera. Those have been passed, but they still need to be implemented. You can expect to see those fought out in Congress in years to come. So Congress will be a battleground, almost no matter who's in charge of which chamber around the Affordable Care Act in the future. More immediate, and for supporters, I think more frightening, is the battle in the courts. There have been 5 U.S. District Court, that's the third highest level of the American courts. It goes from the district courts to the appeals courts to finally the Supreme Court. 5 decisions about the Affordable Care Act in U.S. district courts to date. 3 were in favor of its constitutionality. And I should say the court challenges are complicated and multifarious, but the heart of most of these challenges has to do with the individual mandate. Congress, so the argument goes, exceeded its power by telling you or anyone else in the U.S. that they have to either purchase insurance or pay a fine, or somehow receive insurance or pay a fine. It's essential to creating a large enough so-called risk pool so that there's money to support those who do become ill and or need insurance. But this has been seized upon as a sort of kind of wedge with which the bill is being constitutionally battered. 3 of those decisions have come down as it is constitutional. 2 decisions have been reached saying that the individual mandate is unconstitutional. One of the judges, a judge named Vinson in Florida's district court, threw out the whole bill, saying that the constitutionality of the mandate was, the mandate was unconstitutional, so the rest of the bill could not stand either. He threw out the whole thing. Maybe coincidentally, I doubt it, all 3 of the judges at the district court level who have upheld the bill's constitutionality were appointed by Democrats. Most recently, the D.C. Circuit judge, a woman who was appointed by Bill Clinton, just a couple days ago upheld it. That made it 3-2. The 2 who have denied its constitutionality were appointed by Republican presidents. Supreme Court action is almost guaranteed. The best likelihood or the best guess about this is that it will take place during not in the immediate future, but in the court, in the way they do their business. They will convene again in October of 2011. It will almost certainly be heard, I think, that term. The case is making its way through the appeals courts now. It will happen this spring and this summer, so there won't be time for the current term of the court to take it up. That means the decision will come down sometime in the summer of 2012. The court typically hears cases from October through the fall, winter, and spring, and then delivers its decisions in the summer. Just note for a moment, on the American electoral calendar, that means in the summer of 2012, as the presidential campaign that you may hear about from Bob and eventually me later, is heating up to one of its hottest peaks, this decision will come down either affirming or opposing the individual mandate part and perhaps the entire Affordable Care Act. Most court watchers believe that it will be a 5-4 decision one way or the other, and that the power to determine whether this, again, largest piece of social legislation in the last 40-plus years, in the last 4.5 decades, this decision will come to one person, Justice Anthony Kennedy. We're hoping that his appearance at NYU will give him the credence to do the right thing in this case. I'll also note that the fate of the individual mandate, which again is due to go into effect in 2014, may not or does not rest in the Supreme Court alone. Republicans see this as one of the least popular provisions of the Act. They will continue to whack away at it. I think one of the arguments the Republican Party will make is that getting rid of this individual mandate and possibly other parts of the bill are the best reason to put a Republican president in the White House. You'll hear that argument during the campaign. Another source of challenge or attack is public opinion, not attack, but a challenge is public opinion itself. As with any issue, especially an issue of this magnitude, Americans' propensity to support or oppose whatever the issue is, in this case, the continued battle over the Affordable Care Act, is essential to ensuring either its survival or its endangerment. If Americans were overwhelmingly embracing this bill, Republican attacks would be much more muted, unpopular, eventually would fade away. What does the American populace look like on this? A couple quick figures. There's good news, which is that in a Kaiser poll, the Kaiser Family Foundation has done some marvelous polling around health reform specifically. Every 3 months they release a new poll. As their most recent poll was released last week, happily this happened just after, they were asked, the American people were asked about, what about this defunding approach that Republicans have proposed in Congress? 2/3 of the American public roughly disapprove of that method of attacking. That's the good news from a supporter's perspective. The bad news, I think, is that in this same poll a couple weeks ago, released last week, the Kaiser Foundation asked, what's the status of the Affordable Care Act? A business we've just been spending time discussing. Roughly half of Americans believe it's already been repealed, or they're not sure if it has been. This is not good news if you're a Democratic supporter or any other kind of supporter of this legislation. If half the country already thinks it might have been or has been repealed, it's very difficult to make arguments about its benefits when they think those benefits have disappeared. This is one of the more shocking public opinion results I've seen in recent times. And finally, the bill itself overall, mixed news. This is up, 47% of Americans would like to see it expanded or kept as it is. 43% like the repeal and replace Republican mantra, or just get rid of the whole thing and don't replace it with anything, because lots of uninsured people presumably are the American way. They have been for a while. That 47-43 split is actually more positive than it's been recently. During the run-up to the midterm elections, the Affordable Care Act was in decidedly negative public opinion territory. It's picked up a bit, and that's where it sits at present. Other source of challenge, and in some cases attacks, lie in the U.S. states. I won't go into detail about this. I'll just note that there are a number of particularly Republican governors in more conservative or red states, as we call them in the U.S., who have begun to send back federal money, renounce any federal money designed to help them set up, for example, the state-by-state insurance exchanges under which that state's neediest or most vulnerable people will receive health care coverage. They've sent the money back. The problem, and this was very probably orchestrated and very widely reported, denouncing, it reminds me of states' rights battles of the 1960s in another realm, but this kind of brave state leader sending back this unwanted federal money has a bit of a problem to it, because in a number of states, including Alaska, whose governor most recently decided to send it back, the money had already been spent. So there's now the issue of trying to figure out where they're going to get the money that they have just announced they're sending back. I'm going to leave this to hover now. There's other vital and important aspects of this debate, but I wanted to give you a broad sense of where things stood at present. If you were among the nearly half of the, world population perhaps, who views this as possibly already having been repealed, I'm hoping that the sense of actual swift movement towards implementation that I've described is a positive move. And I'll just close by saying this. I noted at the outset that the Affordable Care Act represents a major reform of the U.S. health insurance system specifically. But no reform effort, no matter how well structured or funded or popular it becomes, is going to succeed in transforming America's broken, as many of us see it, healthcare system, unless we also try to achieve some kind of change in our healthcare delivery system. We can extend healthcare to more people, but we've still got exorbitantly expensive delivery systems that emphasize, if you've experienced the American medical care system ever in your life, you'll know it's very good at and organized to provide care for people who are already ill, often quite seriously. What we're not good at, and what our delivery system needs to move towards, in my opinion, is more preventive, wellness-type care, given the high cost of providing care and the remarkably high incidence of preventable disease that exists in the U.S. As some of you know, I do work on obesity, which is the source of $400 billion a year in relatively unnecessary, for the most part, healthcare expenditures from conditions exacerbated by America's very high rate of obesity. This is an example of a preventative disease that I think our delivery system needs to move towards and leave even a reform of this magnitude behind, or accompany it, I should say. That's a different fight, perhaps for a different president, And for an assessment of the president we've got, let me turn things over to Bob Shrum.
First of all, let me thank Philip, who has done a remarkable job here. I love coming to Abu Dhabi. I love teaching the Sheikh Mohamed scholars, and I love having sessions like this. I think this is an interesting and exciting place, and I love my students. It's tough to follow Rogan. That was one of the most comprehensive presentations in the shortest period of time that I've ever witnessed. And I love sharing a stage with Diane, who has an awful lot to do with the fact that this unique enterprise, this sort of beginning of the Global Network University really works. I have to make one comment about the Supreme Court. I think that a lot more would be at stake than simply the fate of the Affordable Care Act if the court were to strike it down on constitutional grounds. I don't think the American system is made to stand too many Bush v. Gores, where the Supreme Court acts in a very, very political way. Because if you begin to lose the legitimacy of your judicial process, I think you have a big problem. That's why I think in the end, it probably does survive constitutional challenge. The midterm election, I could put quite simply, the Republican strategy of no worked. We went through a period of rancid politics. I mean, you take the individual mandate that Rogan was talking about, that's a Republican idea. It's not a Democratic idea. It was proposed by Republicans all through the 1990s. It suddenly became a Marxist idea. I don't believe, I think it did energize some of the Republican base and get them some votes. I don't believe that's fundamentally what the midterms were about. The midterms were a vote on jobs and the economy. Obama became president, not like Franklin Roosevelt, 3 years into a depression, where people had lived with the catastrophe for a long time, and therefore they had some degree of patience about fixing it. He became president only months after the collapse, and people were very impatient with the fact that it wasn't fixed. The other thing that happened, I think, was the Obama coalition didn't show up. That's partly natural. Young people tend not to vote in midterm elections. And it's partly there was discouraged constituencies all over the Democratic Party who in much smaller numbers voted Democratic or voted in much smaller numbers, period. It's a little like, not entirely, but a little like what happened to Ronald Reagan in 1982. Republicans lost 26 seats, not 60-something, but they had a much smaller base from which they started. Obama's approval actually was higher and has been higher than Reagan's was. Reagan's got down to like 33%, about 18 months before he was reelected in a massive landslide. But I think there was this tremendous dissatisfaction with the economy. Afterwards, confounding everybody's predictions, the president had a surprising and successful period all the way through the State of the Union message. The lame duck Congress wasn't very lame. It raced through some very critical legislation. The tax cut deal, the extension of the Bush tax cuts, even those for people at the top, was coupled with a whole set of other priorities that Obama wanted, like extended unemployment compensation, additional tax benefits for the middle class, refundable tax credits for people further down the income scale, that in effect is a second stimulus. There was no way Obama could have passed a second stimulus package, but the Republicans were so anxious to get the top rate tax cuts extended that they made this deal. That was followed by the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I think after the election, people wrote that off, assumed it couldn't happen. If it had happened sooner, by the way, it might have helped in the midterm. One of the more interesting statistics that I saw after the midterm was 31% of LGBT voters, gay voters, voted Republican. That's almost twice as high as in 2008. And in a number of states and in a number of races that were decided by fairly narrow margins, that mattered. And then the START treaty, the arms control treaty with the Russians, got approved. Now, it should never have been controversial in the first place. It's basically an extension and amplification of what George W. Bush had negotiated with the Russians. But John McCain and the Republican Party decided to make it a partisan issue. There are some other Republicans like Richard Lugar, the Republican ranking member on the Foreign Relations Committee, who decided to act like Republicans used to, or Democrats used to, and say some issues are more important than politics. And he's now a big target of the Tea Party. At the same time, the economic news started getting somewhat better. Not as many jobs being created as people would like, but unemployment down to 9%. Stock market moving up. And to jump ahead to 2012, we should understand that the critical metric then is going to be direction, feeling about the economy, not pure statistics. Reagan in '84, Morning in America, he had his Morning in America when unemployment was the same, about the same as it was on the day he took office. What had happened was it ballooned to 10.8%, came back down to around 7.4% by election day, and people said, gee, it's Morning in America. Things are getting better. It had been 7.5% when he was sworn in. So it's the direction, and that's what's going to be most important in all of this. No one can predict this, certainly not economists, and I apologize if there are any in the audience. You know, the old Harry Truman line, could someone please find me a one-handed economist? But I think that the economy is showing the kinds of signs of recovery that will allow at least a Reagan-like feeling in the country. That is, that we're moving in the right direction. And unless there are unexpected events that create a real disaster. Obama right now, for example, gets pretty high marks from most Americans for the way he handled the Middle East, especially the Egyptian situation. But if this all turns out badly, oil prices really spiked, the economy got hurt, he'd be in a lot of trouble. The next thing that happened was the shooting, which Rogan referred to, of Gabrielle Giffords, Congresswoman from Arizona. And suddenly, and this didn't last, by the way, but suddenly the country pulled back and said, the rhetoric's got to be cooled. We can't have people putting targets over members of Congress. We can't call people evil. We can't say that, you know, people are Marxists or socialists, although that's all creeping back now. Obama's successful period culminated in the State of the Union message. He gave a remarkable speech in Arizona after the Giffords shooting, and then he gave the State of the Union message where he sought to change the narrative. John Kerry had used a phrase that the U.S. was at another Sputnik moment. Obama picked this up, started to use it, and really created an optimistic narrative in the State of the Union message that America could win the future. Now, I think it had echoes of Reagan, it had echoes of JFK. You know, remember in the speech he said, we do big things, we are Americans. Reagan's inaugural address. We believe in our capacity to perform great deeds. After all, why shouldn't we believe that? We're Americans. I mean, so it's the same kind of message. Now, what's happened since then, and optimism usually works in politics, is that the State of the Union message doesn't seem to hold. Partly, I think, because it's been overwhelmed by events, the Mideast and Egypt. Partly because it's been too swiftly reduced to a mantra, a slogan, and it hasn't been vivified for people in terms of their lives. And mostly because the arc of the narrative has changed. The Republicans ran on jobs, they now focus on deficits. Obama's response is, I want to cut too. But if the question is, who's going to cut the deficit, the answer isn't the Democrats. I mean, the Republicans are always going to win that contest, even though they're the world champion deficit creators. But just in terms of the way the country thinks about it, they think Republicans want to cut more, and they do. In part, Obama's got a dilemma here. He doesn't want to cut too soon or too sharply. Goldman Sachs did a report saying that Republican budget that Rogan was talking about, if it passed, would cut economic growth in the U.S. in half in the next year, cut it by 2%, and cost millions of jobs. You have the example of Britain, where this policy has been implemented since last June, and a policy of draconian, swift cutbacks. And Britain actually went in, which had recovered and gone into positive growth, went into negative growth in the last quarter of last year. The The Republicans wouldn't mind, by the way, as long as they didn't get blamed, if the economy went down. They could see it as a very effective path back to the White House. Obama hasn't laid the groundwork for fighting this deficit issue out, either by explaining the deficit. And by the way, presidents never do this. The only one I know of who ever really tried to do this was JFK at Yale in 1962, who went and actually tried to explain economics to the country. Sometimes a deficit is good. When demand collapses, you need to step in and put the demand into the economy. Generally, presidents have denied that they ever favored deficits. In Ronald Reagan's case, constantly proposed balanced budget amendments to the Constitution while running record deficits to get the economy back in shape. The second thing he's failed to do is, as I said a moment ago, is to vivify the cuts. What do I mean by that? He's got to take the elements that are in that bill and not let Republicans talk about them as a generalized, we're going to cut the size of the government, or the old Reagan thing, you know, there's waste, fraud, and abuse out there. All we have to do is get rid of that. We can cut taxes, balance the budget. But some of these cuts the country is not in favor of them at all. I mean, I'll take one that you might think people wouldn't mind. Cut public broadcasting. Well, you know what? People love Sesame Street. And a lot of suburban Republicans love Sesame Street. But he's got to fight back, not just on little things like that, but on big things. And I think he will. I think it will come to that point, because I think this bipartisan, the attempt to be bipartisan isn't going to work out very well. The showdown may come very soon on the debt limit. The debt limit, for those of you who don't understand it, the U.S. government isn't going to run out of money, but it has a statutory authority to borrow that has to be passed by Congress. Ronald Reagan raised the debt limit over and over and over again. Every president has. The Tea Party demands that Republicans oppose any increase in the debt limit. So you have Tim Pawlenty, the former governor of Minnesota, who knows better, who's out there saying, we must stand against the debt limit. He wants to run for president next year. Now, I think Republicans will draw back from this brink, or figure out how. Because if we didn't pass a rise in the debt limit and they were blamed for the consequences, it would make shutting down the government look like child's play. You could have financial markets collapse. You could have millions of jobs lost. You could have interest rates go through the roof. The voters, by the way, in the polls, to speak of polls, when they're asked right now, do you want to raise the debt limit, 62% of them say no. Don't raise it, and 62% of them will want to kill the people who refuse to raise it. Because you go to an ATM machine, it may not work. No one knows what would happen if the United States of America defaulted on its full faith and credit. It's almost inconceivable. The Republicans may overreach in other ways. Rogan said, look, they ran on repealing health reform. Their real aim, it's clear to me, is to repeal the New Deal. I think this has been something inside them that they've yearned to do for a long time. Not all of them, some of them. But the character of the Republican Party has changed. And you have sort of the hard shell conservatives now dominate that party. So even the court cases that we were talking about, the fundamental argument against the individual mandate is that the Commerce Clause doesn't give the federal government the power to do this. And what's being brought back is a very restrictive pre-New Deal interpretation of the Commerce Clause. And by the way, should the court say that the Commerce Clause doesn't extend to allowing Congress to do this, which seems to me, as the federal district judge said in Washington, the act of not buying insurance has an impact on interstate commerce. That's clear. But should they go back to that kind of pre-New Deal interpretation, then all of the civil rights legislation, which rests on this, much of the women's rights legislation, which rests on this, many of the labor protections, which rest on the Commerce Clause power, would be in danger and would be the next set of things that Ken Cuccinelli, the Attorney General of Virginia, would take into court and say this is unconstitutional. If you look at the bill they passed that Rogan referred to in the House, they basically want to defund regulation, financial regulation, Wall Street regulation. They want to shred the safety social net. Paul Ryan, who's sort of their guru in the House, a very smart guy, wants to privatize Social Security. And in the states, you see governors, Republican governors, suddenly engaged in an effort to smash unions. This is what I mean by saying, in effect, they kind of want to repeal the New Deal. The great danger for Obama, looking ahead, is that he loses the battle on retrenchment, that we have retrenchment to the wrong degree in the wrong way at the wrong time. And that would jeopardize him in 2012 in a very serious way. He has one big advantage. The Republican field is weak. They're going to violate, the GOP is going to violate the usual rule of the older GOP that was conservative in temperament as well as policy. They always nominated by primogeniture. Whoever was the next guy in line got picked. So even Bob Dole got picked in 1996, not because he was going to be the strongest candidate, but because he was the next guy in line. Richard Nixon got nominated in 1960 despite a raft of polls showing that he could lose to Kennedy and that Nelson Rockefeller couldn't possibly lose to Kennedy. But Nixon was the next guy in line. The next guy in line is Romney. Romney has a big problem. He wears the mark of Cain as far as most of the Republican Party is concerned, because before Obamacare was Obamacare, it was Romneycare. It was a deal that he basically made in Massachusetts with Democrats in the state legislature that was sort of godfathered by Ted Kennedy. So, and he's going to have to decide how to deal with this. Sometimes he runs away from it. Sometimes he says things like, well, I think states should be allowed to do this. I favor a state approach. I just don't think it should have been done on a national level. Boy, that's not the kind of red meat that's going to satisfy the Tea Party. They don't think it should be done on a state level or any level. You do have a T cluster of candidates, Palin, Gingrich, and Huckabee. I won't go into them because we're going to talk about it. Huckabee's interesting only in the sense he's a genial guy. I've actually been on a bunch of panels with him, but he's actually quite extreme in his views, and I don't think he would wear well if he were the nominee. And then you have the establishment alternatives, the governor of Indiana, Mitch Daniels, Haley Barbour, the governor of Mississippi. I have a slogan for him. You know, he's sort of the greatest lobbyist of the last 20 years before he went down to Mississippi and ran for governor. So I think he could run for president on a slogan, eliminate the middleman. Because, you know, he didn't have to listen to a lobbyist, just listen to himself. His problem is he can't talk about race without putting his foot in his mouth. He's about to sign a bill that allows the state of Mississippi, or mandates the state of Mississippi, to issue a license plate honoring the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. We'll discuss all that more in Q&A. But in most polls, Obama leads all the Republicans. And most remarkably, even in a state like North Carolina, which he barely carried in 2008. So let me leave you with three conclusions, and then we'll get into our discussion. First, I believe the Congress and the White House, the Democrats and the Republicans, are more polarized than they have been in 75 years. The president can reach out. It's good politics to say he's reaching out. I don't think most of the time that there will be a reach back. The settlement or consensus that prevailed in this country, that prevailed in the U.S. for 75 years, basically since the New Deal, has broken down or is breaking down. I mean, Eisenhower, Nixon, even Ronald Reagan basically left all of these things undisturbed. They might go slower, they might repeal at the margins, modify at the margins, but they left the architecture in place. Secondly, I think the stakes are very high. They really go to the character and fundamental fairness and the prosperity of American society. Thirdly, I think the country is changing demographically. Race, slavery, race is the original sin of American history. And it is an issue barely disguised in some cases, that drives many in the Tea Party. Take our country back. From whom? From that guy Obama. You know, from the black president. And I'll give you the other, from the Hispanic immigrants. There's a new bill in Arizona that says that the children of illegal immigrants can't go to public schools, can't get any health care, even emergency care, and this hasn't passed yet, and hopefully it won't, and in talking about constitutionality, and they will there will be a statement in the law that they're not citizens of the state of Arizona. Well, there's no such thing. I mean, you're a citizen of the United States, and then you move to whatever state you want, and you're a citizen of that state. Anyway, there's a pervasive fear of the other that I think has an enormous impact in shaping the Republican Party. Some of my friends who are Republican consultants believe that this is a long-term catastrophe for Republicans, and that in the long term, progressive forces will win, because in politics, as in many other places, demography is destiny. Republicans are losing Hispanic voters in huge numbers. They're just moving over to the Democrats. I think that will accelerate as this anti-immigration rhetoric heats up during the presidential campaign. Young voters have very, very different attitudes than older voters, and of course, over time, that will make a difference. You know, the opposition, for example, to same-sex marriage will literally die out, because people under the age of 30 are for it overwhelmingly. People under the age of 40 are for it. It's only when you get up to 65 and above, a category that I unfortunately resemble, that you get big opposition to it. So Republicans, I think, are pushing themselves into a demographic cul-de-sac. But the next weeks and months and 2 years are going to be a very perilous passage, I suspect a very bitter passage. We're going to see a lot of the anger come back. And if, as I expect, Obama is reelected and the Affordable Care Act survives, you know, there'll be a lot of people in the Republican Party who'll say, well, you know, we got to go in a slightly different direction. I don't think they'll be able to do it, because I think that the folks who are bitter, who are angry, who want to take our country back, now dominate Republican primaries. I mean, Republicans should have won the Senate this year. They just nominated a few cuckoo clocks in a few states because extremists in primaries voted for them. I mean, in Delaware, they rejected somebody who was 20 points ahead and nominated somebody who lost by 20 points after announcing she wasn't a witch. Anyway, all of that said, now we'll go on to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to do a quick little lightning round of the, believe it or not, 18 Republican hopefuls, because right now it's fairly clear who the Democratic candidate will be, barring unforeseen whatevers. But who will be the Republican? So I'd like to get from both Rogan and Bob their quick reaction to this group. Ron Paul, quick.
Ron Paul, impossible.
Okay, Rogan?
Most of mine will be what Bob said.
Okay, Mitt Romney you commented on. Rogan you want to add because of your...
I want to say something about Mitt Romney. I've been saving my line.
Go, okay.
He's not pro-choice, he's multiple choice.
Oh, there you go.
He's a flip-flopper, and Mike Huckabee, who Bob mentioned earlier, in his new book, which I have, for my sins, read cover to cover, goes right after Romney, his putative fellow combatant, saying Romney care is socialized medicine and makes me sick. This is from a Republican about Romney, so that will be to the point. He has the mark of Cain.
Okay. Gary Johnson.
He'll go up in smoke. He favors legalizing marijuana.
Whoa.
Not a good position in the Republican Party.
Nice.
Okay.
I pass. I cannot.
Okay. Tim Pawlenty, Minnesota governor.
I'll take him first.
Yeah.
3 C's about Tim Pawlenty. He's competent. He was a reasonably good governor. He's conservative, and he's colorless.
Ooh, okay. Newt Gingrich, former
I'm
speaker.
for him. I think he's an ideal Republican nominee. I also think he's unelectable.
Okay.
The religious voters who make up the base of the Republican Party will not like a man who's had 3 wives.
Haley Barbour. Anything else you want to add?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rogan?
Ex-lobbyist. Come on.
Ex-lobbyist. Thune, he's out now, John, right?
John Thune, drop out.
Okay. Mike Huckabee.
I think likely nominee if he gets serious and really decides to run. He's making a lot of money at Fox.
Yep.
He doesn't want to walk away from it. I think he's the best positioned guy right now in the Republican Party.
Yes.
Okay. Mitch Daniels.
He's Bush's former budget director, and he has all the charisma of a budget director.
That's being generous.
I'll say as an academic that the intellectuals in the Republican Party love Mitch Daniels, which is the kiss of death. actually for a candidate in either party. Whoever we intellectuals love, not a chance.
Okay. How about John Huntsman from Utah?
I think he has the best chance of beating Obama of this group.
I think
He's the guy who Obama got out of the country by making him the ambassador to China. He was the governor, yes, of Montana.
of Utah. He's also
Utah.
incredibly rich.
Yeah.
His father and he is very, very wealthy and will spend money, I think. He would go outside the system. And we didn't talk about this, but one of Obama's big advantages is the way he can raise money. John Huntsman would actually counter that, I think.
Okay. And Rick Santorum, Pennsylvania.
Oh, come on.
Please let him run. Please let him run.
No, I mean, look, he lost his Senate seat in Pennsylvania by 20 points. You run him in Pennsylvania in a poll right now against the person who beat him, Bobby Casey. He loses by 20 points. Santorum is a legend in his own mind.
Yes, that's true. All right, Michelle Bachmann.
She's the rock star of the Tea Party. They love her.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Republican establishment would do almost anything to avoid nominating her because they think that they probably would lose like 48 or 49 states.
Right.
Okay, Governor Christie, New Jersey.
Not running.
Right.
And pro-choice and therefore unacceptable in the Republican Party.
Now this next one, Donald Trump says he's not yet a candidate, but he did speak to that conservative political action committee the other
Fire
day.
him.
I was going to, that's what I was going to say.
Okay. Scott Walker, not necessarily declared candidate, but getting a lot of press in Wisconsin.
I won't run.
Okay. John Bolton, UN ambassador.
You all know about John Bolton was sort of the neocon who thought Bush was way too soft in his foreign policy. So I think if he really wants to do it, he ought to run for president of Iraq. He's not going to get elected president of the United States.
Might be hard lining up there. Okay. How about Brother Jeb?
He won't do it.
Right.
And the reason he won't do it is he plans to do it in 2016. I think they look at the situation. They say Obama's likely to be reelected. Why does he want to sacrifice himself for that? Exactly. And you could use a little bit more time and distance between
Bushes.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And my last but not least,
She's keeping
what does Sarah want?
She's keeping her reality show day job, I predict.
You betcha.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Okay, just have one quick question for each of them, and then we're going to throw it open to the audience. Rogan, I wanted to ask you this question, and that is, if you were designing the Affordable Care Act, what provisions would you have put in it? You're somebody who's studied this, you're knowledgeable, you're thoughtful, you're also savvy and practical. What would you have put in that act?
We talked about this a bit, Bob and I and Diane, and honestly, American politics, like almost any other democratic country's politics, is a process of compromise and getting the best thing you can. I can't imagine a bill with, say, a public option, which many of us long to see in the bill, a stronger, basically, I won't go into what it is. If you want to know, I can go into it more, but that it was not going to pass with that. I think that the narrow margins we saw, the fact this bill barely made it over the line, was the best deal that could have been gotten. I wish there had been more of the kind of pilot programs that would help bring costs down of healthcare over time. There's a handful of things in that bill that enable, say, various hospital systems or different states to try out experiments. I mean, the U.S. is often called kind of the states or the laboratories of democracy, and there were actually in the Senate version of the bill hundreds of these different pilot programs, which don't cost that much. They give, a handful of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to a set of state actors or hospital system actors or so on, and they compete to see who can bring costs down. And if it works, they diffuse it. This is the way that, as Atul Gawande reminded us, who read the New Yorker, that America went in the early part of the 20th century from being the least efficient agricultural system in the world. We spent more per capita on our agricultural system, and as a result, we're an essentially poor country in the early 20th century. Went from that within about 20 years to being the most efficient agricultural system in the world, all because of the Agricultural Extension Service, a federally sponsored program which seeded these sort of competitions to bring down costs of agriculture and innovate. If we could do that in the healthcare system, if we'd had more of that in the bill, I don't know why it came out, but the final version stripped out a bunch of these Senate cost. I wish there were more of that.
Okay. And then to Bob, one quick question, that is, we didn't really talk about the governorships, but that's going to be also a very crucial battleground in 2012, not just Congress and the White House. And a number of those Democrats who came in 2006 are up for re-election. What, do you have some thoughts about?
There are very few governorships in 2012 because very few states elect their governor in the same year that they elect the president. You'll have it in Washington State, for example, and I think Obama will carry that state, the Democrats will hold on. The real the real problem for Democrats, menace in my view, the real problem is that as we go into reapportionment now, you have a lot more Republican governors and a lot more Republican state legislatures. One of the oddest things is Democrats are going to gain seats in one place that it seemed almost inconceivable they could. I believe they're going to gain seats in California because the deal that was made 10 years ago was they'd protect all the incumbents. So all the incumbent Republicans got these districts that look like pretzels so that they could get enough votes to win. Arnold Schwarzenegger, as a good government move, and with, by the way, the unions and the Democratic Party opposing him, imposed a system that, and got it passed by the people in a referendum. The system in California is now going to be a nonpartisan reapportionment commission that is charged with making compact districts.
Contiguous.
That makes sense.
And the holding communities together. Well, California is a blue state by a giant margin. I think there are going to be some more Democratic seats picked up there, but in most places there won't be.
How is the Obamacare changes the competitiveness of American healthcare system in terms of competitiveness? Because most small business people are quite negative about the care, believing that it has increased the cost of running business.
It's a great question. I'll answer two quick ways. One is one of the major concerns small business had with Obamacare was the cost of reporting requirements. Basically, every time you spent more than $600, I think, a relatively small amount as a business, you had to fill out an elaborate IRS Form 990. That actually has been repealed. It's the only piece so far of this Affordable Care Act to be repealed.
And the president proposed repealing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's gone. One of the sources that small businesses complain most about. The other thing I'll say, though, about the competitiveness of U.S. healthcare more generally, not directly to your point about U.S. business competition, but healthcare business, one of the results of possibly unintended consequences of this act is that the healthcare industry is consolidating at an alarming rate, perhaps a wonderful rate if you're at Morgan Stanley like to do deals, but you're seeing larger and larger hospital systems are combining. Doctors who used to run large doctor-led practice groups that were, in some cases, would have 80, 90, 100, 150 doctors in them, are now having to match up to compete with these ever larger hospital systems. Insurance companies, because they're fearful of the restrictions that I've described that will be in place, are starting to buy, the larger insurance companies are buying up the smaller ones. So I think on the one hand, you will see the U.S. healthcare industry positioned in a way to start to move overseas in a way we haven't seen before. Most American insurance companies don't compete globally all that much. There are much larger insurance companies, for example, especially reinsurance, one aspect of the insurance industry, that operate internationally. They're Swiss-run or come out of Hong Kong. So one unintended consequence is that consolidation may make, kind of to the point of your question, U.S. healthcare companies better able to compete around the world. Back home, small businesses, if they don't have this onerous reporting requirement, and they get the kinds of tax subsidies they're already receiving. This is one of the first things they put in place, if you saw on my popularity chart, already implemented as a tax subsidy to any small business which has to pay more to insure its workers. So the cost, I don't think the costs are going to be that high for small businesses. At least that's the estimate.
Okay.
I'd like Bob in particular to talk about who is leading whom here in terms of the obstructionism and the rhetoric that is pervading the political system. Are the Republican leaders leading the followers to give survey results such as you've put out, or are the leaders responding to a tendency in the society at large and simply reflecting it?
Well, I don't want to violate my rule about the one-handed economist, but both. I think that Boehner is less the Speaker of the House than the servitor of the Tea Party. And at the same time, I think there's a deeper societal phenomenon going on, which we've seen before, by the way, but without the internet, without the web, without all of these means of instant communication. Periods of great change in America tend to be very polarizing periods. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt in 1936, when he was running for re-election, gave a speech at Madison Square Garden in which he said, "Never in the long history of this republic have the forces of greed and privilege been so united in their hatred for one candidate. I welcome that hate." People started cheering. He stopped them. He said, "I should like to have it said of my first administration that in it those forces of greed and privilege met their match." And now people are really wanting to applaud. He said, "Stop. And I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it they met their master." Now he was...
Then they cheered for a half hour.
Yeah, right.
He was responding to all the attacks on him, saying he was a socialist, a proto-communist. He was saying special interests are doing this. And you saw the same thing in the early 1960s, as we went in mid-60s, as civil rights was moving. And, you know, people forget this, but the day John Kennedy was killed in Dallas, the Dallas Morning News had a full-page ad paid for by someone that they ran that said, "Wanted for treason," picture of Kennedy, the President of the United States. So in these periods of great change and turmoil, you tend to get a much more heated rhetoric. That is compounded in this case by something that I guess you could say the early 60s, in a way, we were in a period of demographic change because we were letting people of color actually be people. And a lot of folks had trouble with that. But now you have this vast demographic change where by 2050, is it? America will be a majority non-white nation.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have a hard time dealing with that.
Thank you for those terrific presentations. I wanted to ask you about the, it seemed to me on the basis of the slides that the provisions of the Act were more popular than the Act of which they are the provisions. And if that's true, I wonder what explains that disparity.
It's a lovely question. It reminds me of the fact that individual members of Congress are much more popular in their own districts than the Congress as a whole, which tends to poll horribly with Americans, even in better times economically and so on. So I think that's one piece. Second, I didn't get into this much, but I adverted to it, but I think there was a framing battle to be had in the immediate aftermath of the Act's passage, and Republicans had their arms ready, as it were. They began immediately to denounce this new law in very powerful, often compelling, bumper sticker-worthy terms, in a kind of generic way. They ignored the popular provisions, obviously. Democrats, at least on my viewing, and I know this stuff is much more difficult in practice, and Bob's been there and can correct me, but they seem to move on to the next issue. Actually, Obama admitted as much some months after the campaign results in the midterm, and acknowledged in a at least implicit way that they could have done much more to try to sell or embrace or celebrate the Affordable Care Act. I mean, lots of progressives in the U.S. who saw this as a remarkable achievement were immensely frustrated with the White House and in some cases with Democrats in Congress for not doing more to sell it or celebrate it to the public. So I think what you're seeing is when people are polled and asked about individual provisions, I love that my kid can stay on insurance till 26, or I love that I just got a check. 1.8 million Medicare rebate checks were sent to seniors. It's a naked grab for appeal, I suppose. And it turned out that in one of the Kaiser polls that more than half the people who received the checks didn't associate them with the Affordable Care Act. They did not do a good job of, if you will, politically marketing that act, and I'm not sure they are now. And I think part of it, honestly, was a strategy of let's get as much as we can sort of sub rosa in place. Let's build this wall of success without talking about it much, so the Republicans, when they wake up, they won't realize we've already built. That may work still. I'm sorry.
President, if I could
yeah, please.
just add one thing. The President was functioning as legislator-in-chief for about 2 years, and he compiled a remarkable record. I mean, more progressive change of a major kind than we've seen since the 1960s. But he forgot to be the communicator-in-chief.
Yeah.
You know, in the campaign, everybody said he was going to be all speech and no substance. That was Hillary Clinton's attack on him. It was John McCain's attack on him. Well, he turned out for the most part for the first 2 years of his administration to be all substance and no speech.
Right.
And he needed to make that speech. And in the absence of that, you know, when it happened in the summer of 2009, he should have been out there on the issue right away, saying there are no death panels, rationing is a lie, we are not cutting Medicare benefits. He does have, look, in the fragmented media culture we live in, maybe the presidency isn't a bully pulpit anymore, but it's at least a bully lectern. And he can get heard better than anybody else, and he wasn't out there doing it because as soon as health care passed, he was on to financial reform.
Right.
It's almost like there has to be a bad situation, then he comes in with a great speech, but it gets pretty bad before he...
Yeah, I give him credit for achieving an enormous amount, but I agree with Rogan that there's also, if I could use the word, a philosophical difference between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans tend to get an issue in their teeth and they just don't let go of it. Mm-hmm. Democrats get the issue, and if they succeed on it and it's got bumps with the public, they tend to sort of run away and think if they talk about something else, the public will focus on something else. Well, actually, elections, we've learned, are about what the public wants them to be about, not what the politicians want them to be about.
Right.
I just have a question about the pharmaceutical companies, and I'm curious, how were they affected by ACA? And also, ideally, how, in your opinions, how would they be reeled in somewhat? Just, I mean, with astronomical costs, the PACs that exist, all the donations to various campaigns or, you know, whatever. It seems like they're a runaway organization.
Early in the debate or Washington inside the Beltway activity around what would become the Affordable Care Act, the administration did some deal cutting. I mean, a lot of people say Obama just handed it off to Congress, but actually it was the administration that cut deals with hospitals, small business, which worked for a while, and the drug industry. And then most important, I think, insurance companies, but I'll focus on the drug industry for your purposes. And in every case, basically made the argument, if we get the kind of insurance reform that we're aiming for, you're going to have a lot more customers. A lot more people are going to be buying prescription drugs, they said to the drug industry. So you're going to have to give a little, or in some cases a lot. This bill costs $940 billion. The estimate for what will be raised, this bill is not just budget neutral, it actually is budget beneficial. It makes more. The Affordable Care Act over 10 years makes more than it pays out. That money comes partly from some higher taxes, particularly on very wealthy recipients of Medicare, rich folks who get free health coverage and are going to be required to pay a small amount of higher tax on it. There's a few other tax provisions, but the vast majority, or at least the bulk of that raised money, comes from fees imposed on hospitals to an extent, but largely the insurance industry and pharmaceutical companies. So this week, two large pharmaceutical companies, SmithKline, Glaxo, and I forget which the other one, I think Pfizer, paid $6 billion. They took that much of their profit, or wherever they take it from, and transferred it into the Medicare Part D, I think, trust fund. As part of their so-called down payment on this. So it's a very specific, narrow initial response. I can widen a bit, but there is a way in which the drug companies were financially affected because the idea was they're going to get a lot back on benefits.
Bill wouldn't have passed without them, by the way.
Right.
I have friends who were involved in advising them. They made a decision early on that the
administration?
The
the
pharmaceutical
companies.
industry
The pharma companies.
made a decision very early on that they could support the bill within certain limits, and they spent $100 million on advertising and other things to shore up the bill. If the pharmaceutical industry had gone all in against the bill, I don't think it would have passed.
That's right.
Now, Obama's pragmatic. I mean, he sort of tried to figure out how to get this done. And look, you might not like all of it, and I don't like all of it, but we've been trying to do this for 100 years.
Right.
And it actually got done. I think it might have been a somewhat better bill, and it certainly would have passed sooner if Senator Kennedy hadn't gotten sick and not been there. But other than that, I think Obama did about as well as he possibly could have.
Hi, thanks for the speech. I was wondering, there was a tendency in the midterm elections and some of the governor's races for a lot of the candidates to intentionally run separate from Obama, in many cases specific to the Health Care Act. In 2012, do you think we're going to see the same tendency among other candidacies around the country?
Didn't work very well, did it?
No, it certainly didn't.
So no. Look, this went on in '94 when all of these Democrats, the blue dogs of that day, some of whom, like David McCurdy in Oklahoma, were supposed to be dead weight cinches to get elected to the Senate, and they said, oh, Clinton, no. Don't like Clinton. I'm a different kind of Democrat. And they all lost. I argued before the election, and I believed it very strongly, that this election was going to be nationalized. And Democrats had to go out there with a powerful and persuasive national message, which they did not, in part because some of the people you're talking about put pressure on the White House, and the White House had kind of a milquetoast message. Mm-hmm. You want to go forward or back? Well, no, people didn't want to go back to Bush, but a lot of people wanted to go back to full employment, back to their house being worth something, back to their 401k being worth something. So as a strategy, it was tried in '94. It was retried in 2010. I do not think we will return to it in 2012. I actually think you may see, except in certain states, like West Virginia, where Obama's just deeply unpopular for reasons that don't necessarily have a lot to do with issues, but have a lot to do with who he is. I think you're going to see Democrats running with the president, not separate from him.
James, the other part of the question is, will people run in some way on the Affordable Care Act? I cannot wait to begin seeing the ads and try to make a gauge of that, because it will be some measure, it'll be an even better measure than the Kaiser polls or the Pew polls of how well this is starting to sit with people's constituencies.
It might help to tell all the seniors that the reason they're getting the benefits
checks,
they're
yes.
getting is
Right,
because
they're
of
not
this
trying
bill.
to get
That it wasn't some random bureaucrat who just decided to send out money. Anyway.
Are the Republicans likely to take over the Senate in 2012?
On the numbers, you would have to say so. I
Right.
think that it's possible that the Democrats will keep the Senate. It all depends on how Obama's doing. It all depends on the margin in the presidential race, assuming that he wins. And don't underestimate the capacity of the Republican Party, as presently constituted, to nominate more of these squirrels. I'm serious. Look, Joe Miller in Alaska, he lost on a write-in to Lisa Murkowski. But, this is a guy who says nobody should be getting money from the government, and he's getting farm subsidies and all these other benefits. He's a student loan deadbeat. Christine O'Donnell in Delaware, who, Republicans, even Romney had a very hard time being enthusiastic about her, even though he wanted to please the Tea Party. So I think that there are a couple of things that could help Democrats, but on the numbers, you'd have to say it's likely.
Yes, appreciate the speeches by all of you. And my question is, I am a senior, and I have seen a great deal of abuse to the system, like with the Medicare fraud, when doctors bill Medicare 4 times as much as it's worth, and 3 times as many tests as are needed. And so how are we going to address that issue when we have total government care and we are abusing the system?
Well, I'd say, first of all, it won't be anything like total government care. There's still going to be elaborate systems of private insurance. Some of the early proposals were something like Medicare for all, which some people think if Obama had just pushed that 3-word message, they would have a much more publicly funded and run system. So it's really not, it will be more or less the same system in many cases. It's just people who aren't getting covered will now be covered, and there'll be these exchanges set up by states which will provide care for the most vulnerable populations. But as a senior who receives Medicare, your coverage, you won't see much change at all. There are various systems in place, and I think every single president has tried this, every new director of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has tried to weed out the kind of fraud and abuse you're describing. Bob adverted to Ronald Reagan claiming we could balance the budget and cut taxes just by getting rid of fraud, waste, and abuse. It's awfully hard to do. You need, in some cases, to spend more rooting it out and putting oversight committees in place than was being stolen or frauded, abused, et cetera, away. But I want to make a powerful point that I think the administration and others have not done a very good job of, which is your health care really won't change in any significant way unless you're in the donut hole, in which case you will get much more coverage than you have already. And if you weren't getting full Medicare Part D prescription drug coverage, wherever you live, you've got a check waiting for you at home, which may or may not be from the Affordable Care Act.
You're not going to, but the one thing I want to say is this is not government-run health care.
Right.
If it were government-run health care, it would cost less, save more in terms of the deficit, and you'd have a lot of Americans even more unhappy about it than they were. But, the Republicans did win this kind of war of labeling or framing. I mean, my favorite moment during the whole thing, painful moment, but my favorite moment during the whole thing was when some senior citizen looked at some senator who was out doing a town meeting in August of 2009 and said, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare." So that's how they won. They won the framing war. And they convinced people there were going to be death panels, which there never were. All there was a provision written by Johnny Isaacson, a Republican senator, conservative from Georgia.
A dentist.
Saying that people would have the right to counseling about end-of-life care in writing living wills. That was turned into death panels.
Well, we want to thank you because...
Wait, the last two words of this cannot be death panels.
No.
There's some other word. Preventative care.
Preventative care. Life goes on. No. The idea of this particular panel, taking...
We'll have a much happier panel, I think, after the 2012 election. That's my prediction.
Well, taking two of the most complex and confusing and fascinating topics affecting America today, the health care debate and the political landscape, and trying to put this panel together, sort of the origins are similar to what prompted Gandhi to say when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said, "I think it would be a good idea." So we want to thank you for coming. There's a lovely reception out there, but please give our two panelists, our experts, a thank you.